we're going to talk about trust. What is trust? One definition by Charles Feltman is when I share something important, when I make something important to me vulnerable to you. When I make something important to me vulnerable to you. That might be trusting a child with their preschool teachers, or trusting you with my feelings, or trusting you as my banker with my money, or trusting you, my doctor, with my health. There are many different ways that we trust something important to ourselves, to another. What is distrust? It's when I've learned that the important thing to me that I've made vulnerable to you isn't safe with you. Isn't safe with you. Now, the number one thing that I've learned about trust is that we can survive without trust, but we can't thrive without trust. We could survive without it, but we can't thrive without it. And that is challenging because trust can be difficult, it's dynamic, and it's indispensable. It's difficult because not everyone is trustworthy, period. Not everyone is trustworthy in all things. Not everyone is, we're not always good at judging who to trust. We're not always good at repairing trust. It's dynamic, right? Sometimes someone is really, really great and lets you down. Sometimes, despite all your best intentions, you let someone else down with something they're vulnerable about. And it changes and evolves, and yet it's indispensable for flourishing. In my seminary, I took a class called Psychological and Faith Development Throughout the Lifespan. And they shared that learning to trust was the first developmental skill you needed to learn how to do. They showed how within an hour of birth, a child will turn its face towards its parent or caregiver, often the mother at that place. Within a day, it will start to mimic her facial expressions. It will recognize her voice. Sometimes it will just smell her pheromones in a room. It's there to learn to trust. And in the development of psych, they often talk about all the things that go wrong. And in that class, everyone at some point would raise their hand and say, what about if there was this person who, let's say, grew up with a mother who never said, I loved you and didn't give hugs? Could that person be okay? And we all recognized that there was a moment we were all asking that anonymous question about ourselves. And we held that because we knew at some point in that class we would ask a question like that. And so when we talk about trust today, we're also recognizing that we each bring in a life history of trust. We have landscapes where we have known distrust and trust, and you bring all that today, and as I'm talking, you're going to fill in some life examples. So I just ask, be kind to yourself, just like I and my fellow students, we were kind to each other in that classroom when we were vulnerable with our lives. So what happens when we are in a relationship or a community that is distrusting or distrustful? I know those communities, and I know it doesn't feel very safe. Doesn't feel like I can fully be vulnerable. Communication is so much harder. Things go slower. Often, we're not even successful at trying to achieve whatever we have to achieve, or if we do, and even if we put it up on a wonderful PowerPoint and make a presentation, I just feel like those phony moments where like no one knows how that was pulled from from our guts and put up there, but it didn't feel very authentic. What does it feel like to be trusted? What does it feel like to be trusting and see that being trusting was a wise choice? What does it feel to be like in a culture of trust? The things I see around that are functions with transparency. I know I have a reasonable expectation to predict how things go, so I have less uncertainty. There's an open communication, there's greater listening, there's higher engagement. We seem to understand each other, and so things move a little faster. And when we celebrate something at the end, we know it's because we did it together. Trusting cultures are ones where you could be more authentic, more vulnerable, where they show that there's greater inclusion because people don't have to hide themselves and they can know that they can bring all of themselves. So what are some hallmarks of trust? Because one of the things that is important is that we know how to foster trust. That doesn't mean you should just trust everyone, but how can you be more trustworthy? And how can you put forward practices that grow trust? So there's a variety of different ones, but I'm going to go with the 4 C's. The first C is consistency. Another synonym for that could be reliability. Do we know and reasonably expect how someone will be or act or show up? Will they show up? Will they come prepared? Can I reasonably predict what their personalities will be like? Will there be a consistency across? Now, consistency is different than just being perfect. No one is perfect, right? But for instance, if someone is consistently 15 minutes late and you're cooking them dinner, you might know that you have 15 more minutes to straighten up, right? You probably aren't worried when they're not there 10 minutes after, where someone who's reliably on time or early, you might go, did something happen to them on the road? It's the consistency that helps us know them and know how we can relate to them without being too surprised, right? Without putting more at risk. Now, the trouble that I think we really get into with consistency is that we're not always being our authentic selves and being open about our authentic selves, which means we're promising things we might not be able to deliver on. So, as you might have been clued in if you know me a little bit, and by my last example, I am chronically a little late. And I try to give people a heads up, particularly if this is important to them. I go, I want you to understand this thing about me. Grew up with a family that was never on time, never learned how to do this. I have really bad time management. So it's not about you or how I feel about you. It's that if I arrive on time, it's because I really worked at it. So I'm going to try, but please know that it's not a reflection of how I feel towards you. And if it's really important, I will try to be better about that. Being authentic means you're not promising something that you're continually disappointing people on. So being authentic is a way to commit to being who you are, and so that people can expect you to be reliably yourself. The next one is to be compassionate. To build trustworthy and trusting cultures, you need to be compassionate. Because the number one thing that people need to know to have trust is that you care about them. You care about them as people, not just about what they could contribute, but that you care how they're doing that day, what's going on in the rest of their lives, if they have concerns, and you make time for that. So this is why we encourage in all of our committees and working teams that we start with a check-in. We give an opportunity for people to share about their lives, for us to know those and bring them into the room and give them more or less time depending on what's needed. So we're building in compassion or empathy. People struggle with this because we're often on our cell phones, we feel a great rush of time, we have a full agenda, and yet making the time really counts. Because when people know that you care about them and you feel cared for, it allows us to move faster. When people feel like they're not being cared for, it slows down the work and takes more time. I actually saw this a lot. My very first year in ministry, in my last congregation, there was so much conflict on the board. And the board meetings were regularly about 3.5 hours. Really, really long. And so I met with the board president and I said, let's do a half an hour of spiritual practice every meeting. We're gonna read a poem twice through, we're gonna think on it, we're gonna share, have different verses of that poem read to us. And a couple things happened. One, we were obviously starting slower down, we became more grounded. Sometimes we would learn something valuable about one another. Oh, this person interprets something very differently than I do. They have a different perspective. They learn to listen with one another. And board members would sometimes go like, do we have to spend 30 minutes on this in the beginning? And I'd said, do you notice that our meetings are now 2 hours and 15 minutes? It seems like we could invest that time in that way, right? When you center caring and listening and growth, things can move faster. In fact, everything happens at the speed of trust. The third C is competency. It's one of those difficult things sometimes as like a supervisor or a team member when you realize there's a really good person who shows up, who is caring and kind and friendly, who says yes, and yet can't spell or use grammar, and they're sending out invitations, or just can't do the math right. We rely on competency for trust, because when you entrust something important to you to someone who can't handle that well, then you just can't trust them. I recently had a friend who came over who said he was in chronic pain, debilitating pain for 1.5 years. So much so his wife, he's about my age, had to dress him and shower him, and working was a huge thing. And it was because the radiologist he went to missed something on his scan that shouldn't have been missed. And then every doctor who based the diagnoses on that scan after didn't miss it. And so they were about to do this terrible surgery when he went for a second opinion. They're like, we're sorry, this is actually not that hard to solve. Right? How do you learn to trust again after that? Probably you don't go back to that doctor. But sometimes what you just have to go, and I help to go, this person's a really good person, but they're not in the right function. I can't trust them in this area anymore. And then you work to find a different one. And then the fourth C is communication. Communication. Trusting cultures have transparency. People are sharing information, so people know what's going on, how they could participate. There's opportunities to hear concerns. There's a flow of communication and an openness. Now, I'll tell you, it's hard to do all four C's at the same time. It's hard to do all four C's at the same time. If you're doing a lot of work competently and taking time to be compassionate and also being consistent, it's hard to take time to communicate, find the time to communicate. And if you're doing a lot of communicating, you might feel kind of rushed or shortchanged in another area. So it's about finding a balance, the right amount of intersection between all the C's. So what do we do when something goes wrong? What do we do when something goes wrong? So in a trusting culture, when something goes wrong, it looks like this. It looks like the person who had that failing can trust themselves and the culture and you enough to say, I messed up. That was my responsibility and this thing happened. And is there a way we can move forward together? What do you need? What would help? I want to put things right again. And in a trusting culture, the person will find a capacity to forgive because they understand how we rely on one another. They understand that the connection's been there, that there's generally consistency, and that there could be some pathway forward. It's very hard. It's very hard to repair if there isn't already a context of trust. The other thing is that sometimes when things are really challenging, we need to put our trust in something more mysterious, something greater than ourselves. This is where I sometimes think trust and faith meet. One definition that I love of faith is that in which you place your ultimate confidence. That in which you place your ultimate confidence. And so sometimes when things are going horribly, right? Really not getting along with people, I'm struggling, I feel burned out, like there's no silver lining really to be found. You know, I go to something just much greater. And I think tomorrow the sun will rise, the earth will turn, it will be another day. Another new day. This day won't last forever. There will be another day. And day after day, maybe that can bring a life that I don't see at this moment. What do you place your ultimate confidence in? I'm going to tell a story that I've told some of you before, and I recently shared in our UU Wellspring group about, in Indiana, I took place in this broad-based interfaith organizing group, and often there was a high level of trust, but things broke down. Some of the Catholic priests in the room were really, really pissed off because Planned Parenthood came up in one of our actions. And then the faith-based organizers were like really scared because the Catholic Church told them they had to get out of their offices and also they wouldn't get more money, and that really jeopardized all our work. And then I was a little upset because I felt like everyone was being really controlling and unkind and demanding. And I show up at this meeting. I was 11 minutes late. I was dropping off my kid at daycare, and those kisses took a while. Yeah, thank you, Julia. And as I'm walking in, this one Baptist minister said, well, great then. We all agreed that we'll never talk about gay marriage, Planned Parenthood, or abortion ever again. We're done. That was great. This was a really great meeting. And I'm thinking, wait, you solved everything in 11 minutes? Like, UUs would be like in the middle of the second person's check-in. And we sat down and we talked more, talked about a whole bunch of things. And I'll tell you, I got angrier and more disappointed in this process because I had counseled a new member to my congregation the night before, young man, 20, who 3 years before had been attacked on the street and had been beaten up. And his perpetrators, as he walked away, someone said, what should we do with him? And the other said, let's let the train finish him off, because he was a young gay man in Indiana. And I was thinking about that and the, like, we're not going to talk about LGBTQ issues. And I was thinking about the head organizer, who was a queer woman, queer Jewish woman. And I thought, if she was killed, and would you hold a service? Would you recognize her in your worship services? Would you go to her funeral? Would you grieve this woman who has stood by you and helped all of our communities make our city a better place? And I really struggled, like, with feeling like, can I trust these other ministers in the room? So then I had to think, what do I ultimately believe? And the thing that I knew is true is that we are interdependent. We are interdependent. Every single one of you shapes who I am, not just as a minister, which is certainly true, but as a person. When I carry you in my heart, and your concerns become my concerns, and our accomplishments are shared, our joys are celebrated together. And guess what? I can't imagine that if we were, and I said this, I said, I believe if we stay at this table for 10 years, maybe, of course, you won't be advocating for those things, but I think the tenor of this conversation will be really different because we'll matter to each other a whole lot more. Sometimes when you don't know the way forward, you can't quite figure out how to trust, you have to go to that in which you place your ultimate confidence. In that spirit, let us close with a prayer. O Spirit of life and love, thank you for guiding us to each other, for encouraging us to be authentic, to share who we are, what we could say yes to, and what we need to say no to. Let us be compassionate and empathetic and at least kind to one another and to ourselves. Let us contribute our gifts generously to this community, knowing when we do so, we receive so much back in return. And let us share openly with one another. And together may we know the joyous, fulfilling gifts of being part of a thriving and trusting community. May it be so, and amen.